Welcome to Standard 7A. The goal of this standard is to describe the colonial system in Latin America as it existed in 1800. In other words, if you come across a test question that asks you to describe what life was like in the Latin American colonies 200 years ago, these are the types of things that you'd want to include in your answer. Okay, when we're referring to Latin America, just so we're all clear, we're referring to the region of Central America and South America. Okay, the essential question for this standard is, what were the characteristics, what were the traits of the colonial system in Latin America in the 19th century? 19th century being the 1800s. Okay, some essential understanding for this standard. The Spanish conquest in Latin America, think back to Standard 4, the Age of Exploration. The arrival of the Spanish and the other Europeans is going to see the rapid decline of native populations. The Native American population is going to go down very quickly, and as a result of that, we see the introduction of slaves from Africa. As the Native American population died off, slaves from Africa were brought in to replace the Native Americans as the workforce. So from the moment of Columbus's arrival, as we see here in this painting, the arrival especially of diseases like smallpox is going to begin decreasing the Native American population. We see here in this chart the Native American population in just one part of Latin America, central Mexico. We see 20 years, 30 years after the arrival of Columbus was about 25 million people. Okay, 1520. Within 100 years, that population is going to decline all the way to about 1 million people. Again, largely because of diseases like smallpox. And as we see here, the replacement workers come in the form of slaves brought across the Atlantic Ocean from Africa. This is a topic that we discussed back in Standard 4D in a bit more detail, but the understanding of that helps us here in Standard 7. Okay, some additional essential understanding was that the people who conquered these lands in the Americas, the conquistadors, they, as part of their reward for conquering these lands, were often given governmental authority, okay, by the Spanish and the Portuguese king or queen. And these titles were known as viceroys. Okay, and a viceroy was really a second king. Okay, the king was back in Spain or Portugal. Ruling in their place here in the Americas was the viceroy. We see in the picture Francisco Pizarro, the conquistador who defeated the Incan Empire in modern-day Peru. Well, as part of his reward for conquering the Incas, Pizarro trades in his armor and his sword, and we see him again in very different clothes here as viceroy of Peru. And some of his descendants will also be viceroys of Peru. Okay, so some essential understanding for the standard. Okay, our essential knowledge, we have 5 characteristics of the colonial system in Latin America that we want to be familiar with and able to discuss. The first of these, as we mentioned, were the viceroys. The viceroys set up colonial governments that mirrored. And by mirrored, we mean they looked the same as the governments back in their mother country. In other words, the government in the Spanish colonies looked very similar to the governments back in Spain. The governments in the Portuguese colonies, same as the governments back in Portugal. These colonies were divided up into viceroyalties. Okay, we can see, for example, on the map here, we had the Viceroyalty of New Spain, the Viceroyalty of New Granada, Viceroyalty of Peru, Viceroyalty of La Plata, and the Portuguese Viceroyalty of Brazil. Okay, so these were the big organized areas within the Spanish, and in the case of Brazil, Portuguese empires. And as we mentioned in our essential understanding, the viceroy, basically the second king who ruled in place of the king here in the colonies, had an incredible amount of control over these viceroyalties. Okay, the second piece of essential knowledge is the importance of Roman Catholicism, which had a very strong influence on the development of the colonies. From a very early point in the arrival of the Europeans in the Americas, the desire to spread their religion. We saw back in Standard 4 the 3 G's, one of which was God, meaning a religious reason behind the age of exploration. In the Spanish and the Portuguese colonies in particular, the spread of Roman Catholicism is going to be a big deal in those colonies. We see throughout Latin America the building and construction of Catholic churches. We see scenes even today like this famous scene in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. Just the very visible statues and other symbols of Catholicism. Here, the statue of Jesus overlooking the city from a mountain high above the city. Okay, another example of the role and the influence of Catholicism. Okay, and the modern day legacy, as we see today, that of Catholics in the world today, that 42% of all Catholics in the world today live in Latin America. Okay, the region that we're taking a look at here, a region which 500 years ago would have had no Catholics, now accounts for close to half of all the Catholics in the world. Just another example of what influence Catholicism had on this region. Okay, a third piece of essential knowledge is that mining precious metals, and precious metals typically refers to gold and silver. They're the metals that you wouldn't throw away. If a soda can wasn't made of aluminum, which we typically throw in a trash can or hopefully a recycling can, but was made out of gold or silver, we wouldn't throw that can away. We would go right to the bank when we were done to exchange that metal because it's a precious metal. The mining of these metals for export, for sending away from Latin America back to Europe, was a major element of the economy in this region, especially in the Andes region in western South America. In other words, the mining for gold and these other precious metals, when they were found, they were turned into bar form. Okay, they were turned into these rectangular blocks for easy shipping. And the Spanish, you could almost picture the cities on this map as almost being like the banks. And these routes here showing the routes that the Spanish treasure ships, which you can think of as almost like armored cars today, these are the routes that they followed. The ships arriving from Europe, picking up all of the gold and silver at these various ports, and then returning back to Europe. The importance of these metals again being because at this time in history, these precious metals served as money. So it literally was like digging money out of the ground. And so Spain and Portugal in particular were very interested in getting as much of this gold and silver and other precious metals out of the ground in Latin America and returned back to Europe. Okay, a fourth piece of essential knowledge is the construction, the building of major cities throughout Latin America as symbols of colonial authority. Okay, the Spanish, the Portuguese, when they arrive, it's not that there weren't cities. The Aztecs had Tenochtitlan, for example. The Incas had their capital city at Cusco. But the Spanish and Portuguese, with a European mindset, the cities are going to spread beyond just the capital city. These cities are seen as symbols of power. Okay, and so we see some examples. One's mentioned in the standards that we probably want to know the locations of would be the city of Havana in Cuba, We would want to know, as an example, Mexico City, built on top of the old Aztec capital in Mexico. Lima on the Pacific Ocean in Peru. The city of Buenos Aires in Argentina, and in the Portuguese colony of Brazil, Sao Paulo. Okay, so these cities are examples of European cities that were built to show colonial authority, to show the power of the Europeans. Okay, and our fifth characteristic of the colonial system is again something that we reviewed back in Standard 4D, was that rigid class system that the Europeans bring with them and impose on Latin America. And this system, as we see in the graphic here, placed people of European descent, people whose background was European, were at the top of society in this system, known as the casta system. Think from your World I class, the caste system back in India, same idea here, the casta system in Latin America. Okay, some examples of this: the peninsulares were the people from Europe. So in other words, people born in Spain and Portugal on the Iberian Peninsula, where the word comes from, they automatically were on top of society. So they set sail from Europe, they arrive, they're automatically at the top. The system is so rigid and strict that their own children, if they weren't born back in Europe, if they were born in the colonies here, they were automatically a lower rank. They were Creoles. Okay, there's even examples of people sending pregnant wives back to Europe, trying to get back to Europe to deliver the babies on European soil so that they'd be peninsulares and not Creoles. But these two groups are really going to be the governmental control of the colonies, largely the peninsulares and to some degree the Creoles. Okay, over time we start to see the blending, the mixing of these various groups in Latin America. The combination of one European parent and one Native American parent resulted in a group called mestizos. Okay, and the mixing of a parent from Europe and a parent of African descent resulted in another group known as mulattoes. These two mixed groups with some European ancestry aren't as high up the social pyramid as the peninsulares and the Creoles. And then the groups that didn't have European ancestry and who did most of the work were down at the bottom of this social pyramid. So people of African ancestry and people of Native American ancestry wound up at the bottom of this social system. And those are the characteristics of the colonial system that we need to know and the information we need to know for Standard 7A.